This incident happened to me last year on Halloween. My little brother and I were home alone because our parents had gone out to a Halloween party. They tasked us with handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters, which bummed my brother and me out since we had made plans to go trick-or-treating with a few friends. Our parents told us we were too old for trick-or-treating and suggested we invite our friends over instead. My friends declined my invitation, eager to collect candy themselves. So I was left home alone with my brother, handing out candy to strangers. As the evening wore on, a lot of people stopped by our house. By 10 p.m., almost all the candy was gone, and my brother and I decided we'd eat the last few pieces. We settled on the couch, watching a scary movie and stuffing our faces with candy, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. I stormed off the couch, wondering who could be knocking at our door this late. I assumed it was just some late-night trick-or-treaters. Even if that were the case, I had turned off the porch light and Halloween decorations, which should have been a dead giveaway that we were out of candy. Maybe it was just my parents coming home early. Being cautious, I looked through the peephole. To my surprise, I saw a suspicious man standing on our front porch. He wore a black hoodie with the hood pulled over his head, obscuring his face. The only detail I could spot was a beard and dry, crusty lips. There was no way this guy was a trick-or-treater. He wasn't wearing a costume and was far too old to be out begging for candy. His hands were stuffed in the front pocket of his hoodie, and he looked incredibly thin. Every single red flag went off in my head about this guy. There was no way I was opening the door. Still peering through the peephole, I watched as he knocked on the door again. He seemed desperate for us to open it and was shaking a bit. It wasn't cold outside, definitely not cold enough for someone to be trembling. I felt a chill run down my spine as he gave me a bad vibe, and I wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. "We're out of candy," I shouted through the door, trying to sound firm. I watched as a smile spread across his face. It wasn't friendly. It was menacing. "Are you alone in there?" the man asked, his voice raspy and dry. "Should I call the police?" my little brother asked quietly, gripping his cell phone tightly. His fear was palpable, and it sent a shiver through me. The man let out a low, grumbling laugh. "Sounds like you're not alone in there." I continued to watch him through the peephole, my heart racing. His hands remained wedged tightly in his pockets, and he was still shaking slightly. I wondered if he was armed. I decided to take action and spoke to him in the most intimidating voice I could muster. "Get the hell away from my house, or I'll call the police," I shouted, hoping to scare him off. His smile faded, replaced by a look of fury. His teeth were piss yellow, and I concluded he was likely some homeless crackhead. Fortunately, he backed off without trying to break in, probably realizing I wasn't messing around. I didn't stop watching him through the peephole until he was completely off our property. My brother and I breathed a sigh of relief, but were still on edge. We decided not to call the police, feeling it wasn't necessary since the man hadn't harmed us. We returned to the couch, trying to distract ourselves with the movie until our parents came home. A short while later, as we settled back in, I felt a strange urge to check the window. I moved cautiously towards the curtain and peeked through. My heart stopped as I caught sight of him again, the man in the black hoodie. This time, he was no longer standing at the door. Instead, he was crouched low, peeking through our window. My breath hitched in my throat. His eyes were wild, darting around as if he was looking for something or someone. I quickly backed away from the window, my heart racing. "What's wrong?" my brother asked, his voice trembling. "He's at the window," I whispered urgently, pointing toward the living room. My brother's eyes widened in fear. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling in my stomach as I considered our situation. The man had already tried to get in through the front door, and now he was at the window. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. "There's a man outside our house. He's been lurking around, and I think he might be dangerous," I whispered urgently to the operator. As I spoke, I glanced back at the window. The man had stood up slightly, still peering through, and I could see the desperation in his eyes, a mix of anger and hunger that sent chills down my spine. "I need you to stay inside and lock all your doors," the operator instructed, her voice calm yet firm. Police are on their way. Can you describe the man?" I gave her the details I could remember, all while my brother gripped my arm tightly, fear written across his face. After what felt like an eternity, the police arrived, their lights flashing. They quickly surrounded the house, and I breathed a sigh of relief. The man, realizing the situation was turning against him, darted off into the night, disappearing into the shadows. The officers questioned us about the incident and took our statements. They promised to increase patrols in our area and search for the man who had escaped from a nearby asylum, about 5 miles away. It sent chills down my spine to think he was so close to us, and even more horrifying to realize he had been lurking right outside our home. The next day, my brother and I woke up to a terrifying news report. An elderly woman who lived just a few houses down from us had been brutally injured during an attack. Her neighbor discovered her lying on her front porch, bleeding and barely conscious. My brother and I immediately knew who had done it and told the police what we knew. They couldn't do much from our vague descriptions since we hadn't seen many details of his face. They assured us they would investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They went on the hunt for the man, but he eluded them. As the reality of what happened sank in, the knowledge that he had been lurking outside our window, peeking in, intensified my guilt. I still blame myself for the elderly woman's injury. If I had called the police on Halloween, perhaps they could have caught him before he ever made it to her house. It's terrifying to think that someone like him, a man who only had the urge to hurt, was so close. He hadn't taken anything from the elderly woman's house. He only wanted to inflict pain. That thought lingers in my mind, a constant reminder of how close we came to a tragedy that could have been prevented. Before we move on to the next story, if you're still here, make sure to subscribe and let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments for more true stories. Thanks. It was Halloween night in 2015, and what happened that evening would become the scariest incident of my life. Nate, my best friend, bailed at the last minute, so I was left wandering the streets alone, dressed as a zombie and collecting candy from houses that didn't care. Most kids my age were at parties or causing trouble, but here I was, walking around for free candy like a little kid. It felt awkward, but I wasn't ready to go home yet. There was one street I hadn't been down. It was at the edge of town, near the woods, where the houses were spread out and barely anyone lived anymore. People said the area was creepy, but I wasn't superstitious. It was just houses, old, run down, and forgotten. I stood at the corner, looking down the street. The sky was a bit orange from the last light of the day, and the whole place felt off, but I figured, what's the worst that could happen? I could hit a couple more houses and call it a night. I walked down the street, passing dark houses with overgrown yards. No lights, no decorations, not even a porch pumpkin. These weren't the kind of houses people invited trick-or-treaters to. Still, I went up to the first one, an old Victorian place with its windows boarded up. I knocked once, half expecting it to fall in from the sound. Nothing. I shrugged and turned to leave, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, somewhere behind me. I stopped dead, my heart pounding. I looked over my shoulder. The street was empty. I waited for a second, listening, but there was only silence. I shook my head, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was late, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I kept walking, a little faster now, eager to get back to the busier streets. But after a few steps I heard it again, footsteps, steady, keeping pace with mine. I stopped again. This time, I didn't turn around right away. I just stood there, staring ahead, listening. The footsteps stopped too. Slowly, I turned my head and glanced back. There was a man standing in the middle of the road. He wasn't far, maybe 30 feet behind me. He looked normal enough at first glance, just an average guy, but something about the way he stood made my skin crawl. He didn't move. Didn't say anything. He just stared at me. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to ask if he needed something, but the way he just stood there, silent, made my throat tighten. Instead, I started walking again, faster now, my heart thudding harder with each step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and each time he was closer. Not running, but always closer, like he was measuring his steps, waiting for something. By the time I hit the end of the street, I was almost jogging, trying to keep calm but failing. I cut through the park, hoping to lose him, but when I looked back, he was still there, closer now. No matter how fast I went, his pace never changed. It was like he knew exactly how fast to walk to keep me in his sights. I started to panic. My legs felt weak and my mouth was dry. I could hear him now, the sound of his boots hitting the pavement, slow and steady, getting louder. I broke into a full run, sprinting through the trees, branches whipping at my face. My breath came in short gasps, and every time I looked back, he was closer, always the same slow walk, like he didn't have to rush, like he had all the time in the world. I tripped, hitting the ground hard, dirt and leaves scraping my hands and knees. I scrambled to get up, but before I could, I felt a hand wrap around my ankle, cold and rough, dragging me back. I kicked hard, connecting with something solid, and for a second, his grip loosened. I pushed myself up, running again, but I could hear him, closer now, his breathing heavy. I made it to the street, thinking if I could just get somewhere with lights, somewhere with people, I'd be safe. But the street was empty. No cars, no people, just darkness. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. I knew if I did, he'd catch me. I rounded a corner, my heart racing, and that's when I felt it, a hard shove from behind. I went down, hitting the ground hard, my face scraping the pavement. Before I could even try to get up, he was on me, his knee pressing into my back, his hands gripping my arms, pinning me down. I struggled, trying to twist away, but he was strong, too strong. I tried to scream, but his hand clamped over my mouth, smothering the sound. I could feel his breath on the back of my neck, heavy and ragged. And then he spoke, his voice low and calm, like this was just another day to him. "Quiet," he said, his grip tightening. "No one's coming." I didn't have a chance to fight. His hand was on my throat, squeezing, and all I could do was gasp, my vision blurring, my chest heaving as I struggled to breathe. My arms went limp, and the last thing I heard before everything went dark was his voice, soft and almost mocking. "Trick or treat." I woke up on the cold ground, my body aching. My throat burned, and I felt lost. Then I remembered everything, the man chasing me, the grip around my neck. I tried to move but felt weak. My legs felt heavy, and I couldn't stand up because my ankle was twisted from tripping while running. I lay there listening to the silence. Hours passed, and the sky slowly began to lighten. Just when I thought I might be alone, I heard voices nearby. "Over here," someone shouted. I wanted to call out, but my voice wouldn't come. I saw flashlights moving through the trees, and my heart lifted. A group of people found me and rushed over. "We found him," one said. Hands lifted me carefully, and a blanket wrapped around me. "Stay with us," the paramedic said. "You're safe now." As they wheeled me to an ambulance, the sirens blared, and I felt relief wash over me. Later, I learned that the police had caught the man. He was a local who had been missing for years and turned out to be a psycho who had been stalking the area. I was shaken but grateful. I had escaped, and he would never hurt anyone again. I wasn't much of a Halloween person growing up. My parents were pretty religious, so I never did the whole trick-or-treating thing, never dressed up. Halloween was just another night. But Sarah, my girlfriend, was obsessed with it. She loved everything about it. The costumes, the parties, the decorations. She'd start planning weeks in advance, and it became a big deal for us every year. And because I love her, I went along with it, even though Halloween parties weren't really my scene. This year, though, we were going to Jake's party. Jake wasn't exactly a friend, more of an acquaintance, one of those guys you can never really trust. He was always a little too friendly, always looking for attention, throwing massive parties just to prove he was the cool guy. I wasn't excited to go, but Sarah had convinced me. She'd even picked out matching costumes. Vampire for me, witch for her. So I caved, figuring it would be like every other party. Loud, messy, but harmless. We showed up around 9 p.m., and the place was already packed. Jake had really gone overboard with the decorations this year. The front yard was filled with fake tombstones, plastic skeletons hanging from the trees, and eerie red lights glowing from the windows. Inside, it was even worse. There were fake spiderwebs everywhere, thick fog from a machine creeping along the floor, and loud music pounding through the walls. It felt more like a haunted house than a party. Jake, in his usual obnoxious way, greeted us at the door, already drunk. He was dressed as a zombie, his face caked in makeup, and his breath reeked of alcohol. He handed us drinks right away, a red punch he'd been bragging about all night. Sarah took a sip, laughing at how sweet and strong it was. I hesitated but took a drink too, trying to relax and enjoy the night. An hour passed, and that's when I started to notice things were off. At first, it was subtle. People were laughing too loud, too long. Faces that had been familiar earlier in the night now seemed distant, their expressions vacant, like they weren't fully present. Conversations drifted off mid-sentence. A few people were just standing in corners, staring at nothing. I figured everyone was just drunk or high. Jake's parties were always wild, and there was no telling what people were on. But then I saw this guy. He was in the corner of the living room, dressed as some cheap zombie, but there was something seriously wrong with him. He was leaning against the wall, his head drooping, and his hand was dripping blood. At first, I thought it was part of his costume, but when I got closer, I realized it wasn't. Blood was running down his arm, pooling on the floor. No one seemed to notice. I walked over to him, trying to stay calm. "Hey man, you okay?" He didn't respond. His head lolled to the side, and his eyes were half closed, unfocused. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but he jerked back, his whole body shaking. His skin was clammy, pale, and for a moment I thought he was going to collapse. "Hey!" I yelled, louder now. But still, no one paid attention. Everyone else was wrapped up in their own world, laughing, dancing, oblivious to what was happening around them. That's when I started to feel weird, too. The air in the house felt heavy, thick, like it was pressing down on me. My head began to spin, and my vision blurred. The lights seemed too dim, and the music, so loud just a moment ago, sounded distant, like it was underwater. I felt like I was moving in slow motion, my thoughts jumbled, disconnected. I tried to shake it off, but something was definitely wrong. I looked around for Sarah, panic starting to creep in. I found her sitting on the couch, staring blankly ahead. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her face pale. She wasn't talking to anyone, just sitting there, motionless. I rushed over to her, grabbing her hand. "Sarah, you okay?" She didn't respond at first. Then she slowly turned her head toward me, but it was like she didn't even see me. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I shook her gently, trying to snap her out of it. "Sarah, come on, we need to go." Finally, she blinked, and her eyes focused on me. She looked terrified, but not in a way I'd ever seen before. It wasn't fear from being scared. It was something deeper, something more primal. "I don't feel good," she whispered. Her voice was shaky, weak. I think there's something in the punch." I felt my stomach drop. I'd only had a few sips, but now it made sense. Whatever was happening to everyone, it was the punch. I looked around the room again, and that's when I really saw what was going on. People weren't just drunk. They were sick. Some were slumped over, unconscious. Others were vomiting, their bodies racked with violent spasms. One guy was crawling across the floor, his fingers clawing at the carpet as if he was trying to get away from something. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were bloodshot, rolling back in his head. The air smelled wrong now, metallic, like blood and bile. The music had stopped, but the room was filled with this low, buzzing noise, like a swarm of insects or a broken speaker. I could hear people moaning, crying, some of them gasping for breath. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the door. We stumbled through the crowd, stepping over people who were barely conscious, their bodies twitching and jerking like they were being electrocuted. When we finally made it outside, the cold air hit us like a slap in the face. Sarah collapsed onto the grass, her breathing shallow. I knelt beside her, trying to stay calm, but inside I was freaking out. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The line was busy. I tried again, still busy. I looked around, and that's when I saw the others. People were scattered across the yard, lying on the ground, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways. Some were foaming at the mouth, others were completely still. I heard distant screams coming from inside the house. The front door was wide open, but I couldn't see anyone coming out. Sarah's breathing was getting worse. Her skin was clammy, her eyes fluttering. "We need help," she whispered, barely able to speak. I tried to carry her, but I was too weak. My own body felt heavy, like I was sinking into the ground. That's when I saw a figure standing in the doorway of the house. silhouetted by the eerie red lights from inside. It was Jake, still dressed as a zombie, but he wasn't his usual cocky self. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around, wild and terrified. He stumbled toward us, pulling out his phone with shaky hands. I called the ambulance," he stammered, his voice cracking. I didn't know. I didn't know this was going to happen. I thought it was just a party." I glared at him, barely able to muster the energy to speak. "What did you put in the punch, Jake?" He shook his head frantically. "I swear, man, it wasn't me. I didn't spike anything. Someone else must have." I didn't know. I didn't trust him. I never had. But right then, it didn't matter. What mattered was that help was finally on the way. Jake stood there, trembling, his face streaked with sweat. "I just wanted people to have a good time," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Then he backed away, disappearing into the chaos as the paramedics arrived. They took Sarah away in a stretcher, her eyes closed, her chest barely rising. I sat there, watching as they carried out more people, some still twitching, others covered with sheets. Whatever had been in the punch, it wasn't just a drug. It was something else. Something that turned that party into a nightmare. Some people didn't make it. Others were left with permanent damage. Sarah and I survived, but that night has never left me. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. Blank, lifeless, twitching in the darkness. And I hear that buzzing like insects crawling inside my brain. I haven't been to a Halloween party since. If you have any spooky stories, feel free to email them to the Gmail shown on the screen.